Hi, and welcome to a video lecture on Korea, also known as the Hermit Kingdom. Please take guided notes or your own notes while you listen to and watch this presentation, as it will help you prepare for quizzes and exams in the future. Geography of Korea. The Korean peninsula is only slightly larger than the state of Minnesota. If you'll recall, Japan's just below it is only slightly larger, or about the same size as Montana. So these are not very big countries. But the positioning of Korea is important because it sits right between China and Japan. Korea is a mountainous area that is close to both China and Japan. Its two major rivers, the Yulu and the Tumen, mark the border with China. For much of Korea's history, it has been controlled by China, Japan, and Russia. China, in particular, has really influenced Korea substantially. They adopted China's way of governing and system of government. They took on a number of cultural traits that the Chinese possessed, and you still feel it today in Korea. It is very similar to China in terms of its cultural and societal mores. The history of Korea. The first Koreans are believed to have migrated to Korea from northern Asia around 3000 BC. These people lived in villages and survived by fishing and farming. The Koreans also practiced shamanism, which is the belief that both living and non-living things contained powerful spirits. Priests known as shamans helped people communicate with the spirits and understand their will. So shamans would have these trance-like religious experiences where they would communicate with these spirits and then pass that information on to the non-shamans in the room. Shamans could, in theory, heal the sick and escort people into the next world as they were dying. Shamanism is not limited to Korea. It can also be found in countries around the world. Shaman healers are very popular in many places around the world. By the 100s BC, Korea had been conquered by China. From 109 BC until 220 AD, the Koreans would be under the control of the Chinese. During this time period, they were heavily influenced by the Chinese. However, they were still able to maintain elements of their own culture. The Koreans, because they were invaded so many times, learned how to defend themselves and to hold on to ways of life that were really important to them in the face of these invading countries. They really were able to control local government and did not heed interference by the countries that came and took over them. Korean rulers also tried to keep the country isolated from the outside world, the West in particular. And because of this, it earned the name the Hermit Kingdom, like the hermit crab in that picture there. But Korea still had to fight off threats of foreign invasion on a regular basis. They too did not want Christian missionaries in their country, and that was one of the reasons that they didn't want to trade with the West. The Japanese invasion. In 1910, the Japanese took control of Korea, making it a part of its greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The co-prosperity sphere was Japan's idea that if they came in and conquered your country, that would make you more prosperous as well as them. And in the end, that didn't work out for Japan. But that was their goal, was to take control of the region, be the dominant player in East Asia. In the process, Japan attempted to get rid of Korea as a state, so they didn't want it recognized as its own country anymore. Korean language was made illegal, and the Korean culture was completely banned. They were instructed to take over or basically inherit Japanese culture as their own and forget about Korean culture. But after World War II, things changed. Japan surrendered in 1945, which meant that Korea was liberated. And American occupying forces moved into the southern half of the Korean peninsula, while Russian forces, who had been preparing for an invasion of Japan, occupied the northern half. The reason for this movement by both big countries was the Americans didn't want it to become communist, and the Russians didn't want the Americans taking it over. And neither of them wanted Japan to ever be able to go in and dominate a country again. So after World War II, by mutual decision, Korea was divided in half at the 38th parallel. You can see that line right in the middle of the slide where the country is cut in two pieces. Northern Korea would be Russian territory. Up top, that's the red part of the map of Korea. And South Korea would be in the care of the United States. That's the green half of the country, of the peninsula. And it is at the 38th parallel because that was really the most even part. So each country would have an equal share of Korea. So a problem started to arise after World War II. The U.S., represented by Harry S. Truman on the right, and Russia, represented by Joseph Stalin on the left, distrusted one another. The Soviets feared the capitalist West and imperialism, and Western countries, especially the U.S., striking out and adding to their empires. And Western leaders feared the spread of communism, which we saw obviously in later wars that we were involved in, namely Vietnam. Truman's policy was containment to prevent communism from going outside of China and Russia. So relations between Russia and the United States grew worse. The U.S. formed a democratic government in the South, unfortunately with a very dictatorial ruler, who we'll meet in a second, and Russia set up their own communist government in the North. So once again, here's Korea. It really doesn't have control over its own country. Two major superpowers are now in charge of each half of it. And so we can see where this is going. On June 25th, 1950, Joseph Stalin approved an invasion of South Korea. So the Russians wanted the entire country to themselves. President Harry S. Truman, with the help of the United Nations, which was basically a peacekeeping group of a number of countries, sent American troops to fight back. So they got approval from the UN because the U.S. was a member of the UN to go in and fight against the Russians who had invaded southern Korea. In October of 1950, UN forces that was predominantly made of the U.S. Soldiers, but UN armies are often made up of a number of different countries' soldiers, but this was predominantly the U.S. They marched northward across the 38th parallel and into northern Korea, and with the goal of unifying the entire country, which translated that meant the U.S. would take over the entire country and boot Russia out. The Chinese were very alarmed by this, and they sent thousands of Chinese troops into North Korea to push UN forces back across the 38th parallel. So they came down from China into North Korea with the intent of getting the American forces out. They did not want Korea taken over by the U.S. This looks like it's like some GI show here. where two ladies are performing for the troops. So here's a map of basically the layout of the Korean War. You can see on the left where North Korea comes down. Those are the red arrows, and they push all the way down almost to the South Korean coast, and that was their big push and farthest they got, almost to the coastline there. And then simultaneously, South Korean troops and Americans were going north into to North Korea to launch their counteroffensive, and that took place for 2 years. The war went on for 3 years, basically, until they called a ceasefire. But you can see, the North Koreans really made some serious headway into South Korea, as did the American troops crossing the 38th parallel there as well. So the fighting, again, went on for 3 more years, and really there was no final victory ever for either side. A ceasefire was assigned in 1953, but no one claimed to be the winner of that war. What came out of it was known as the DMZ. That's the demilitarized zone, and it's set up between the North and South. You'll see a video about this tomorrow in class with Lisa Ling and National Geographic. But basically what a DMZ is an area, a length of a country that keeps the two warring sides apart from each other so they don't attack one another. And that's what the DMZ is. So it should be noted that while the ceasefire stopped the war, nothing was signed afterwards. So no treaty has ever been signed between the two countries. So technically, North Korea and South Korea are still at war, and which means the U.S. and the USSR, or Russia now as it's known, are still at war as well because they represent each side. And there's a picture of the fencing and the razor wire along the fence where they eye each other uneasily, the South and North Korean troops. So what happened in North Korea after World War II? In the North, communist leader Kim Il-sung became dictator, and North Korea became the People's Republic of Korea. Kim Il-sung established a cult of personality, making himself an object of adoration. Kim Il-sung also began developing nuclear weapons. His was a very small country, a piece of a country, and he wanted power, and he knew that nuclear weaponry would give him that. Cult of the personality can also be found in people like Adolf Hitler, John F. Kennedy, leaders who people just become smitten with and really follow blindly. And this is how Kim Il-sung started long before his other family members took over, getting the Korean people to be devoted to him. So here's some of the propaganda posters, pictures of him. These are not unlike the ones that you guys saw of Mao Zedong in the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. These are designed to make people embrace their great leader, which is what they called him, and dear leader. And here he is hugging small children. Everybody's happy. That's Kim Il-sung on the left, and then that is his son, Kim Jong-il, who took over after Kim Il-sung passed away. So it became dynastic. He set it up so that his family would always follow in his footsteps, much like the Chinese dynasties did. So after Kim Il-sung passed away from a heart attack, his son, Kim Jong-il, who looks a little airbrushed there to me, continued his father's nuclear program, really investing in that. He also continued his father's cult of the personality, and had the Korean people really worshiping him, or they would not be treated very well if they didn't go along with this whole campaign of his greatness. In 2011, he too died of a heart attack. Kim Jong-il did. And he was followed by the next member of the family, who is Kim Jong-il. He's the Kim Jong-un. He's the youngest son, and he is now considered the leader of North Korea. Although he too has had some health problems. The North Koreans are very, very secretive. It is the most oppressed country probably in the world. Very secretive and very brutal, harsh treatment of people who don't follow the government's line of thinking. So South Korea, now that you've heard a little bit about North Korea, South Korea was under the dictatorship of Syngman Rhee. He was forced to resign, 60 years ago, following a student-led uprising against his harsh rule. However, the Americans were still backing this government, even though he was a dictator himself. It was still considered a democracy compared to North Korea. So that just gives you some insight to how bad North Korea really is. General Chung Hee Park took power after Syngman Rhee was deposed, and he began to strengthen the South Korean economy using the Japanese model, which is much like ours. It's a capitalist free market. So private property is fine. You can own your own business. You make your own money. The government doesn't get any of it except, of course, for taxes. And so what happened in the process was South Korea emerged as a major economic power in East Asia. Some of the things that they create that you may well be familiar with are Samsung phones. That's big manufacturing in South Korea, as well as Hyundai cars, automobiles. They do a ton of manufacturing of planes, ships, cars, and electronics in South Korea. So their economy is very strong. So today, Chung Hee Park ruled through dictatorship, also, just like Syngman Rhee, amazingly. But in the 1990s, a true democracy really came to Korea, and elections were held officially for the first time, probably in the history of the country, in 1997. South Korea became a true democracy as opposed to something that was propped up by the West. And that's where they are today. So hopefully you used your guided notes or took your own notes to follow along with this presentation. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.